Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's program. Please stay tuned to the end of today's program for a brief update on our upcoming programs. We have some terrific programs lined up for you in September and October. Also, please consider becoming a member of the World Affairs Council Town Hall. It's a great way to support our organization and to help us continue to provide you with this quality programming. You can go to our website at lawacth.org and find out about all the wonderful membership benefits. So please check that out today. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion, which will start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to bring on Dan Schnur, our own professor who leads us in our weekly Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Kim, how are you?
Oh, I hope everybody had a nice long weekend, but we're back, raring to go, right, Dan?
Absolutely. So we're all set for today, and of course next week we're moving to our new time slot, 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern. So I'm very excited for the shift.
Me too. I think that's going to be a great change. We have two great meaty topics for you today, Dan. Number one, Texas moves to restrict abortion access. What comes next? And second, California's recall election. Will Newsom survive? So without any further ado, let me send this over to you. Thanks, Dan, so very much.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for that ado. It was just the right amount. Thanks to all of you also for being with us today. We're only going to cover two topics. I know that happens fairly frequently, but we knew going into today, when Jessica and Claire and I talked, that between the new abortion law in Texas and next week's California recall election, that we had a lot to cover on these two matters. And so we'll expand back out to our usual three topics next week, but we are going to spend a little bit more time digging in today, given the import of these two issues. So let's start with Texas. The big news out of Texas, of course, and out of Washington, D.C. as well last week, was that the state legislature in that state passed a bill that would ban all abortions in the state of Texas after 6 weeks after conception. This is a so-called heartbeat bill that says once a doctor can detect a heartbeat of an infant, and there's some controversy over what is detected at 6 weeks as an actual heartbeat or some other type of audio impact instead. But the law itself says that after 6 weeks, once this heartbeat is detected, that no abortion will be allowed in the state of Texas. I will talk a little bit later about the intricacies of the heartbeat bill and the other audio matters that might be detectable at that early point in a woman's pregnancy. But also the other thing to know is that this legislation was written in such a way to make it much more difficult to challenge in court. We'll talk a little bit more later, if you'd like, about what the intricacies of that is. But the bottom line to know is not only would this be an effort to ban the overwhelming majority, estimated between 85 and 90% of abortions in Texas take place after the 6th week, but would make it much more difficult and time-consuming to challenge this new law in court. So before we go any further, and before we begin to talk about the political ramifications of this issue, because of course our program is politics in the time of coronavirus, before we go any further, we just want to get a sense of our group on this really important issue. So Claire, thank you for posting that question. Pretty straightforward, but very, very important question for all of you to consider. How would you describe your own position on the question of legal abortion? Do you believe that abortion should be illegal under all circumstances, no matter what? Second option, do you believe it should be illegal under most circumstances with only a few exceptions? Third, do you think abortion should be legal only under a very small number of circumstances? Or fourth, do you believe that abortion should be legal under no circumstances whatsoever? Well, let's see what our group has to tell us today. Very interesting and also not surprising. 94% of our group believes that abortion should be legal under all or most circumstances. 54% said all with no exceptions whatsoever. Another 40% said most circumstances. Only 6% of our group say that abortion should be legal under very few circumstances. No one, from our gathering at least, says abortion should be legal under no circumstances at all. So what I want to do now is I want to provide some context and some contrast, just so we can better understand how this issue is playing out at the national level. The question I just asked you, and I've asked Claire to keep those results up there for a point of reference. The question I just asked you is a question that Gallup has asked our respondents, has asked the country's respondents for decades now. And while they don't ask the question every year, they ask it every few years. The last time Gallup asked this question to a national audience was in 2018. And let me tell you what the responses were. Nationally speaking, 32% of Americans felt that abortion should be legal under all circumstances. 13% said under most circumstances. 33% said under few circumstances. 19%, almost 1 in 5, said there should be no exceptions whatsoever. So let's add up those two categories. For our group, 94% said that abortion should be legal under all or most circumstances. Nationally, at least as of a few years ago, the number was 45% of those two combined categories, less than 1/2 of what our group showed. And on the bottom end of that survey, 6% of our group picked one of the two other options, that abortion should be legal under very few circumstances or under no circumstances at all. 52%, a majority of American voters, believe that abortion should be legal under few or no circumstances. Now, admittedly, these numbers may have changed by a few points over the years, but I will tell you, you have to go back more than 20 years into the late 20th century before you see a significant difference. So, not my place, of course, to judge who's right and who's wrong, but as we dig deeper into this issue, it is worth knowing the marked difference between those who gather for our programs each week versus how a national electorate feels on these issues. Once again, our group, 94% says abortion should be legal under all or most circumstances. Nationally, a few years ago, the number was 45%. Again, as you see, abortion should be legal under very few or no circumstances, 6% with our group. For the American public as a whole, 52%. Now, Claire, we can go ahead and take that survey down. The key here, though, is in the few category. There are a lot of different definitions as to what legal in only a few cases can mean. And so even though our group comes at this issue from a very different perspective than the nation as a whole, that distinction is going to be helpful to us as we try to navigate the political ramifications of the abortion debate heading into the midterm elections next year. Now, when voters are asked to define themselves as pro-choice or pro-life, the numbers are roughly the opposite of the results I mentioned. Usually in most polls, voters who call themselves pro-choice make up in the low to mid 50s, 53, 54, 55, 56%. Those who call themselves pro-life nationally tend to amass in the mid to high 40s, 45, 46, 47, 48%. So this suggests that many voters who call themselves pro-choice still want to see abortion legal, but only in a small number of cases. But here's a key question. When voters are asked if they want to see Roe versus Wade overturned, even though the numbers on pro-choice and pro-life are not all that different, When voters are asked nationally if they want to see the seminal Roe versus Wade Supreme Court case overturned, voters are roughly 2-to-1 against overturning the decision nationally. So we're going to get into the specifics of how this case in Texas is going to affect next year's elections in just a moment. But before we do, one more question about all of you, for all of you. And again, read the question carefully. We're not asking whether you think the US Supreme Court will overturn Roe versus Wade. I think we can tell from our first question that the numbers will be pretty strong in one direction on that one. No, rather, this question says, do you believe that the US Supreme Court will overturn Roe versus Wade? And we've given you 3 options here. Within the next 12 months, yes, but not quite as quickly within the next 1 to 5 years, or no, you don't think the court will overturn it. So Claire, let's see what our group has to say on this one. Very interesting. Look at those results. 41%, a pretty strong plurality, do not believe the court will overturn Roe versus Wade. 30 and just under half, 49%, believe the court will overturn the decision, either within the next year or within the next 1 to 5 years. And that's where the politics in next year's election gets interesting, because both parties know that overturning Roe versus Wade is very unpopular, even if the electorate's broader thinking on abortion is a little bit more evenly divided. They know that overturning Roe versus Wade is extremely unpopular. And that explains some of the messaging we've been hearing from the two parties over the last several days since the state of Texas moved on its new law. Now, here's a way I'd encourage you to think about this, not just on abortion, but on other very contentious, high-profile issues. Generally speaking, when a very divisive policy debate emerges on the political landscape, it's not only useful to hear what the two sides are saying about the issue, but how loudly they're saying it. Now, after last week's court decision, both pro-choice and pro-life advocates made it clear how important they believe that this case would be to the future of legal abortion access in the United States. But on one hand, you had Democrats sounding a battle cry as to the political consequences of the decision, and they predicted great political benefits for their party because they felt that the Texas case would tremendously motivate a pro-choice Democratic base to turn out in the midterms. Republicans were a lot more subdued. Now, Republican office holders overwhelmingly voiced their support for the court's decision, but very few talked about it as a political weapon that could mean some type of advantage to them, the way their Democratic opponents have been predicting. Now, this quieter reaction doesn't take away from the fact that the Republican Party is very strongly, overwhelmingly pro-life in the 21st century. But even while most Republican voters are likely to be pleased with the policy ramifications of the new Texas law, it was notable how few party strategists were talking about the potential political benefit this would mean for their candidates. And what that suggests to me is that while Republicans still think about abortion as an issue that can be a great motivator for their socially conservative base, they may be less confident about how the issue is going to play with swing voters in competitive races around the country next year. Now, Democrats obviously strongly see the benefits that this issue provides for them with college-educated voters and female voters. And those have been the two pillars of strength in the Democratic Party's successes over the 2018 and 2020 election cycles. But it's also worth noting that the last time that abortion emerged as a high-profile issue on the national landscape was just weeks before the 2020 election, when Donald Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court after the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it was widely assumed last fall that pro-choice voters would be much more motivated to vote in the aftermath of Barrett's confirmation, given their anger at the way they believe that court nominations were handled under the Trump administration. And while Joe Biden won the election, it's worth remembering the Democrats lost ground in the House and in the Senate. And most exit polling suggests that the change from Ginsburg to Barrett had a much more pronounced impact on socially conservative Republican voters than pro-choice Democrats. Now, to raise the stakes even higher, Roe versus Wade could either be on the verge of being overturned or could have already been reversed by the time voters go to the polls next November. It now looks like a Mississippi case that would also greatly restrict the availability of legal abortion is going to be considered by the Supreme Court this fall, next month, in fact. That means the Supreme Court would likely issue its decision on the Mississippi case next June. And of course, that's just as the campaigns for Congress are going to be starting to heat up. Now look, Supreme Court decisions have a much more direct impact on the lives of the American people than Supreme Court nominations. And so it's entirely possible that, unlike in 2020, pro-choice voters could be the more energized cohort next fall, unlike last year. But what do you think? If we're going to look ahead to next year's midterm elections, understanding what's going on in Texas, realizing this Mississippi case, oh, Claire, can we thank you, put that back up again. The Mississippi case is going to be revisited by the Supreme Court. And given the way the court is leaning under its current makeup, the question for all of you is, which party do you think will benefit more from the abortion issue in 2022? Will Democrats be more motivated because they see a threat to abortion rights? Or will Republicans be more motivated because they see it as an opportunity to advance on an issue that they've been very eager to move on for many, many years? Or will it turn out to be pretty much of a wash? What does our group show, Claire? Wow, 59% of you, 59% believe Democrats will be more motivated on the abortion issue next year. Only 17%, less than 1/3, say that Republicans will be. Well, you may be right. As I said earlier, 14 months before that election, the body language on both sides does suggest a motivational advantage for candidates who favor abortion rights, and many of you have picked up on that also. But it is worth remembering that that dynamic, if it plays out, would reverse recent political trends, most notably last year's election. It also assumes that the Democrats would benefit more from the support of college-educated women and younger people than the potential drop-off they could experience from socially conservative working-class voters whose support was so important to Biden's victory last year. Now, you all remember that Biden won those 3 key Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, by razor-thin margins. And it was in those states that working-class voters felt some cultural affinity to Biden. Now, Biden worked very hard throughout the election last year to convince those voters that he didn't intend to defund the police or otherwise adopt the more aggressive, the more ambitious criminal justice reform goals of some of the louder members of his own party's left flank. And he succeeded. But in order for our group's prediction to come true, Biden is going to have to pull off a similar balancing act next year on an even more highly charged and emotionally divisive issue of abortion. Now, this doesn't mean to suggest that Democrats don't have the potential to realize considerable benefit from Supreme Court activity on this issue over the next year. But it's worth keeping in mind that the issue might not play out in nearly as clear-cut a fashion as advocates on both sides seem to believe right now. Let's move on. Let's move on to our second issue. And we're going to talk about the California recall, because of course that vote is 1 week from today. We were going to talk about this last week before other critically important issues got in the way. But with 7 days to go, let's talk about California's recall election. And for those of you, for the many of you who watch this webinar from out of state, my guess is you've read about this now in the national media as it's begun to receive more and more attention. But as most Californians in our group know, and worth a reminder for those of you from out of state, the recall election the recall ballot will actually have 2 questions on it. The first question is simply a yes or no. Do you believe that Governor Newsom should be recalled from office? Yes or no, up or down, vote straight on. And then the second question will list the 52 other individuals. Now, there have been 7 write-in candidates who've been approved for the ballot, none of whom have held previous political office. So the second question will ask us to choose between the candidates who are available to replace them. We'll talk more in just a minute about how this election's been playing out so far. But before we do, let's go to our next question, if we can, Claire, just to get a sense for our group on this topic. Question: do you intend to vote to recall Governor Newsom? Yes, he should be removed from office. No, he's not an effective governor, but we should wait until next year when the regular election takes place. No, I don't think he should be recalled, and I'm going to vote for him for re-election next year. Fourth, for Californians only, I will not vote in the recall election. And fifth and finally, I do not live in California. So I'll beg the patience of our non-Californians on this one, but let's see what our California voters have to say. Only 6%, interesting, very interesting, only 6% of our group is going to vote to remove Newsom from office next week. 57%, who'll be very happy to see this, I imagine. More than half of our group will not only vote against the recall next week, but vote to re-elect him next year. 20% say that they don't think he should stay governor, but it should be done on the normal timetable under a regularly scheduled election. And only 1% say that they won't vote in the recall election, and that's really good news for Newsom himself, because Newsom's greatest challenge for the last several weeks has not been persuading undecided voters in the political center to oppose the recall rather than to support it. But Newsom's biggest challenge has been to motivate his Democratic base. Public opinion polling until recently for most of the spring and summer showed that when all Californians voted, Newsom defeated the recall by a very comfortable margin. But until just the last week or so, polls were showing that among likely voters, the campaign was going to be very, very close. Last week, the Public Policy Institute of California, which is one of the 2 most respected public opinion surveys in California, came out and showed that Newsom was beating the recall by a pretty considerable margin, even among likely voters, which means he was doing a very good job of motivating his supporters. And our results today reflect just that, the success of that strategy. Now let's back up for just a minute before we open this up to your questions to talk about the strategy there. Joe Biden, through most of his political career, used to have a saying that he'd really love to offer to voters when they weren't entirely enthusiastic about something he'd said or done. Biden used to like to say, "Don't compare me to the Almighty, compare me to the alternative." And that's the messaging strategy that you hear from most incumbent politicians running for re-election, because they want the voters, the incumbents, to think about their decision not as an up or down referendum, but as a choice between the available options, mainly because being seen as preferable to another candidate is a much lower bar for success than being judged against an imaginary and often unrealistically idealized option. Now, Newsom's challenge for most of the year has been that the rules for a California recall election do call for a referendum, literally. As I said earlier, that first question on the ballot is just a yes, we want to recall him, no, I don't. And his potential successors, as I mentioned earlier, aren't even introduced until the second question. And so for a long time, that was making it really tough for Newsom to frame the election as a choice, as opposed to just a thumbs up or thumbs down vote on how people think he's doing. Now, there's two ways for a candidate of either party to motivate their base. One is to tell them something really exciting and inspiring about their own record or their own goals. The other is to tell them something really frightening about their opponent. Now, last spring, when it looked like the world was going to be opening up again because of so much progress having been made in fighting the pandemic, Newsom tried that first approach, and he traveled around the state talking about various funding and economic recovery projects, attempting to sell his record to the voters. And that didn't work. So his team instead shifted to Plan B, to try to frame the recall as a choice, not a referendum. Now, first, Newsom tried to frame the race as a campaign against Donald Trump. And I think primarily because Trump wasn't on the ballot the way he had been in 2016 and 2020. And he wasn't in the Oval Office the way he was during the 2018 midterm elections. That didn't really seem to motivate Democratic voters. Then Newsom began to talk more broadly about all the Republicans running. There's all these Republican candidates who are very conservative and who will change the state, but because he was talking about them as a group, it was sort of an amorphous argument, not really a tangible one. And that didn't seem to be motivating Democratic loyalists either. But all that changed when Larry Elder decided to run for governor. Most of you by now are familiar with Larry Elder, the longtime talk show host, who has had a multi-decade record of saying and doing very, very controversial things over the course of his career. Mr. Elder is pro-life. He is opposed to a mask mandate or a vaccine mandate. He's against a minimum wage and believes it should be set by the marketplace, not by the government. And he's also had some very controversial episodes in his personal life. But what Larry Elder did is he provided Gavin Newsom with a perfect foil. So instead of trying to run against Donald Trump, instead of trying to run against a lot of Republicans who no one's ever heard of, all of a sudden Newsom had this living, breathing, talking opponent who said and did really controversial things. And Newsom and his team moved very aggressively to portray Elder as a Trump-like threat who could do great harm to deep blue California. And it's not surprising that over those weeks, Newsom's position in the polls has increased very considerably. Now, one of the interesting wrinkles about this recall is that Newsom, while obviously urging voters to vote no on the first question against the recall, he's also been encouraging his supporters not to vote on the second question at all. And there are a lot of Democrats who think that might be a mistake because they believe if the recall does succeed, which is looking less likely now, they might rather have a lesser known Democrat or a somewhat less conservative Republican as governor. Whereas if all of Newsom's supporters don't vote on the second question, that means the votes of Newsom's opponents will disproportionately impact who wins that second ballot. So again, question for all of you, and again, my apologies for those of you not in California. When you cast your ballot, or maybe you already have, what are you going to do on the second question? Tell us, one, I'm voting for the recall, and so of course I'll vote for replacement. Number two, I'll vote against the recall, and I will vote for another candidate, even though the governor has asked us not to. Third, I will vote against the recall, but I'm not going to vote on the second question at all. Newsom is exactly right. Vote no on question one and then get out. Or again, fourth, I do not live in California. So based on the previous question, it looks like we'll have a relatively small number of people voting for the recall. But let's see if we can, Claire, how the numbers come down on people voting on the second question. And look at that, it's almost a dead even split. 38 to 40, a slightly larger number, very slightly larger number, will take Newsom's advice and not vote for another candidate. 38% will vote for one of the replacement candidates. And if we had time in another question, we'd be asking you whether you're going to vote for one of the Republicans or one of the lesser known Democrats. But we'll have to come to that once the recall's over. There's one other last interesting point on the recall I'd like to make before we bring Jessica on and go to your questions. So we've established already that Newsom, like most incumbents, would much rather run an election that's a choice and would try to avoid a referendum. But what I've seen over the last several weeks is not only has Newsom been very successful in portraying the election as a contest between him and Larry Elder, but he's also set up a contrast at a much broader level, not just between candidates, but between states. And in this recall election, one of Newsom's most powerful and most successful messages, particularly over the summer, since the emergence of the Delta variant, has been to compare and contrast California against more conservative states like Florida and Texas, where the governors are not imposing as stringent measures on their populations as Newsom is here. Now, Newsom has an advantage. Unlike last year and even last spring, at that point, Newsom was calling for absolute shutdowns of our communities, as all of you remember, and that obviously had great economic and very significant political repercussions. Now, because of the vaccines, he's not calling for shutdowns. He's simply urging people to wear masks and to get vaccinated, and has let it be known that under the right circumstances, he might support mandates on those fronts. Governor Abbott in Texas, Governor DeSantis in Florida, Governor Newsom in South Dakota, and a number of other conservative Republicans around the state are not imposing mandates. And in fact, many of them are preventing local elected officials in cities and counties in their states from putting on mandates of their own. And so Newsom not only running against Larry Elder, but he's essentially running California against Florida and Texas, and is saying to the people of California, look at how much better off we are because we are being so much more careful. And while not all Californians are buying that argument, it looks like a very, very large majority are. And if Newsom does survive the recall next week, he will have Larry Elder to thank, but he'll have the governors of Florida and Texas to thank as well. So with that, I'm going to ask one last question before Jessica, and this is one where the non-California participants can weigh in. But I'd like to hear from our California people too. Should your state, whether your state is California or Florida or Texas or anyone else, should your state allow a governor to be recalled from office? Yes, for any reason, if the voters want him or her gone, as is the case in California right now. 2, yes, we should have a recall in our state, wherever our state is, but only for a serious crime. And so, for example, there were some people who felt that perhaps Governor Cuomo of New York should have been recalled had he not resigned. Or third, no, a recall is a silly idea. We have elections every 4 years, and then that's when we ought to pick our governors, not in between, even if they've committed a serious crime. So let's see what our answers are on this one, Claire, if we can. Wow, very, very interesting. 73%, almost 3/4 of you, believe that the recall should continue to exist, but it should only be in place for a serious crime. And much smaller percentages would want to keep the rules the way they are here in California or forbid it altogether. My guess is it's very likely that once this recall is passed, we'll see the legislature move to raise the bar for a recall election in the future in California. Let's see if they take your advice. But in the meantime, much more importantly, much more immediately, let's have Jessica join us. And Jessica, maybe we can go on to our group's questions. What do you think?
Sounds good. Before we launch into the Q&A session, I would like to thank our viewers for your continued support. The recent impact of the Delta variant has impeded our plans to begin resuming in-person events, which provides us income to cover our expenses. It is uncertain when we will be able to resume in-person events at this time. Therefore, we need our members and viewers' support more than ever through donations and also renewing their memberships. Please help us bridge the gap through this challenging time. Please go to our website at lawacth.org and click on the donate button or renew your membership. and we greatly appreciate your support. All right. The first question, are medications that induce abortion covered by law?
Medications that induce abortions are covered by law in most states. And in fact, the Texas law that we've just talked about would address not only an abortion procedure conducted by a medical professional, but a medically induced abortion as well. Both would be prohibited after roughly 6 weeks.
Is it lawful for men to make decisions about women's bodies?
I don't know that it's avoidable. Yeah, we've talked before and we'll talk again in the future about how much larger the percentage of men is in elected office in most states in this country and in our federal government than there are women. I don't know if I would be completely comfortable only allowing elected office holders to make decisions based on their demographic status. I certainly understand and respect the very strong beliefs of a pro-choice woman or a pro-choice man who says that because this is an issue having to do with a woman's body, that only women elected officials should be involved in the decision. But I worry that that opens up some very, very complicated questions. And then if you only allow elected officials of a certain gender to vote on some bills, does that mean you'd only allow elected officials of other demographic characteristics to vote on others? So I don't know that I would be as absolute as the questioner suggests, but I will note that in those states where there is a larger percentage of female legislators, it has been much more difficult to move anti-abortion legislation in those states. Now, I don't know the cause and effect there. Do more progressive states elect more women and therefore tend to be more pro-choice? Or do women elected to office, regardless of the ideological leanings of their state, tend to be more reluctant to move on an issue like this one? But the ultimate result is when you elect more women to office, that does shift the discussion on this issue in one direction. And for the strongest pro-choice advocates in our group, and it appears from our poll that that's a large majority, certainly not the only answer, but an important part of the solution is electing more women to office.
If Roe is overturned, is it possible that future litigants could seek to have SCOTUS decriminalize state abortion laws based on equal protection versus privacy, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg had argued?
It's possible, but I think it would be difficult. The most likely outcome, if the court were to overturn Roe versus Wade, is for states to make these decisions on their own. And according to the Guttmacher Institute, which analyzes these types of questions on a very, very detailed basis, it's their estimation that 22 of the 50 states would either completely eliminate or more dramatically restrict the availability of abortion in their state. 28 states would maintain the current law or expand it, depending on the state itself. The other option, of course, would be for Congress to pass a law on this issue. And it's one of the reasons that Democrats have such high hopes for the midterm elections, that they believe that they can turn out voters in much greater numbers, knowing that Democratic candidates could promise the passage of pro-choice legislation at the federal level. But in the absence of that legislation passing, I suspect that these decisions would be made on a state-by-state basis. You have some states that would continue to offer legal abortion under the current rules. Others that would keep abortion legal, but under more limited circumstances, and some that would outlaw it altogether.
Do those who are keen to legalize a heartbeat anti-abortion law or laws like it feel any responsibility to set up social support for the unwanted children born as a consequence? Do lawmakers who vote for such a law adopt and care for such children?
So it's a really important question. And the answer is some do. Some elected officials, some pro-life elected officials argue very strongly on behalf of government programs that provide additional types of support to those children and their parents. And a smaller percentage, but some pro-life legislators have in fact themselves adopted children. Many more have pushed for a relaxation or a broadening of adoption rules in order to make the process more accessible. Though certainly not every pro-life elected official, and I don't have a good number on the percentages, would support increased funding for these children and their families. But a considerable number, in fact, do. Others believe, as I know you've read in various places over the years, some believe that this is the type of responsibility that should be taken by the nonprofit sector, by private charities and philanthropies and so on. But there is a certain cohort of pro-choice politicians who do argue that if you make abortion illegal, you do need to provide additional support for these children and their parents.
Can you address the apparent anomaly that the biblical white right opposes abortions that occur among mostly Black and brown mothers, meaning prohibiting abortion will mean more lower economic costs and eventually more Black and brown voters?
I don't feel qualified to address that. I've not talked to every pro-life elected official, and in fact, I've probably in the country, and I've probably talked to a very, very small minority of them. My impression is that for most of them, from what I hear and what I read and what I conclude, is that the overwhelming majority of pro-life politicians and pro-life voters don't think about the issue in the context of race or ethnicity, but certainly some do. My impression, though, is that a very large majority of them think about this in either religious or moral terms, which apply applicably to a mother, regardless of her racial or ethnic heritage. There's certainly some exceptions to that, but my impression, at least, is that it is a relatively small number.
Bounties have been mentioned. Is there any reference to those in the law? And this is in reference to, I guess, the $10,000 that is offered to people that report those who aid women in getting an abortion in Texas.
I'm so glad this question came up because I alluded to it briefly at the beginning of the webinar. The fact that the Texas law has been drafted in a way to make it much more difficult for a court to overturn. Normally, most laws are the responsibility of a government to implement, a local government, a state government, a federal government. And so for those who feel that that law is unconstitutional or otherwise unjust, they can move to ask the courts to prohibit a government from acting on it. The Texas law doesn't do that. There's no role in this prohibition for the Texas state government or for local governments in that state. Rather, and the term being used by the opponents of the bill is bounty. Rather, what the bill does is it empowers individuals in a community, even if they have no prior relationship to the mother or her family, to file a lawsuit to keep that abortion from happening after 6 weeks. And the plaintiff in that case would be awarded a $10,000 judgment that some are calling a bounty when that case is heard. The practical considerations of that, and I'm not qualified to go through the legal premise, but the practical impact of that is it's much more difficult to sue an individual before they act than it is to sue a government or challenge a government once a law is passed. So when the first Texan files suit against the first mother in that state who has an abortion after 6 weeks, then at that point, pro-choice advocates can engage legally and try to get courts to consider whether the plaintiff's decision was constitutional or not. And that challenge will ultimately make its way to the US Supreme Court. But it's going to take a long time to get there. And one of the reasons there was so much consternation among pro-choice advocates as of the Supreme Court's decision not to involve itself last week, was not just on the question of the Texas case itself, but because the U.S. Supreme Court did not prevent the law from taking effect, that means that any legal challenges to the constitutionality of the law are going to have to wait until the case is filed. And it's going to be quite a while after that original filing before the constitutionality of the law is determined. And until that point in time is reached, until that decision is reached, that's an awful lot of mothers and an awful lot of lawsuits who will be operating under the Texas law, even if it is ultimately overturned.
People are asking, who pays the bounty, the patient or the state?
My understanding is that this is something that for which the defendant would be liable. And interestingly enough, the law does not provide for any financial reward for the defendant should the case not be successful, but only incurs a penalty if it is.
About abortion being an issue in the midterm elections. So do you think that abortion will be a primary issue? Will it be immigration, or will people still be reflecting on what happened in Afghanistan?
Well, as is the case whenever we talk about a very contentious issue, it's always worth reminding ourselves how far away next November's elections are and how much else can happen in the world between now and then. Last week, we talked about the impact that Afghanistan might have on the votes. Well, this week we're talking about another issue completely, and it's entirely possible that next week or the week after that, we'll be talking about another issue, which may be part of the voters' decision-making process in the midterms. I do think this will be an important issue. As I mentioned earlier, recent history suggests that pro-life voters tend to be more motivated when this issue is high profile than pro-choice voters. But as I said, a decision by the Supreme Court has much more direct real-world ramifications than the appointment of a Supreme Court justice. So while recent history would indicate that pro-life voters will motivate more than pro-choice voters, given the potential decision, at least, by the Supreme Court next June in this Mississippi case, that dynamic could be reversed. And it is worth referencing that the state of Mississippi passed a law which has been prevented from being implemented until the court hears the case. The state of Mississippi passed a law saying that no abortion after 15 weeks would be legal in their state, and they passed very specifically meant to be a challenge to Roe versus Wade. Now, obviously, that's not as onerous as a 6-week moratorium, which is what Texas is talking about, but it's certainly a considerable shrinking of the available time window compared to the 24-week window which currently exists under the Roe and the Casey court decisions. So if the U.S. Supreme Court were to overturn Roe versus Wade next June, then my guess is the issue would skyrocket in its level of importance and could end up being something that motivates pro-choice voters to a much greater degree. If our audience's prediction from our poll question is right, Jessica, and Roe v. Wade is overturned, but not next year, then I don't think the political impact will be nearly as clear-cut.
Thank you to our next questioner, Jay Shelton, because he gave us a nice transition question from the Texas topic to the recall. Will the Texas abortion decision have a trickle-down effect to the California recall? Meaning, will or would it put the idea and remind people in California in their heads consciously or subconsciously to turn out more one way or the other? For example, will some independents and Democrats feel or are currently feeling more energized?
Well, it's a great question. And it's one that it's a point that had there been more time, I would have wanted to talk about in the first half of the webinar. But I believe, and it's pretty clear to me, that the Texas decision has worked to Governor Newsom's benefit. Because when Newsom talks about Republican governors and conservative leaders in these other states, in deep red states in particular, the court decision Texas's law gave him an opportunity not just to contrast California with red states on issues relating to COVID, but another issue of critical importance to California voters, the issue of abortion rights. California is overwhelmingly a deep blue pro-choice state, and Newsom's ability to argue that a Republican governor could endanger that status has had a profound impact. Now, the Republicans argue, to be fair, that there's relatively little that a governor can do on this front. And in fact, that this is an issue to be decided at the federal level. And even if Roe versus Wade were overturned, a Republican governor facing a 2/3 Democratic legislature would not be capable of overturning Roe v. Wade all by himself. But there are other steps that a governor could take. And in fact, Larry Elder, well, he didn't indicate, but a supporter of Larry Elder's indicated last week that he, if elected, would revisit state-level funding for legal abortions. Elder didn't exactly deny it, but he didn't exactly confirm it either. Regardless, there's no question, and again, it's a really smart point the questioner raised. Newsom has moved very aggressively to make this part of his message on why Californians should allow him to remain in office.
A large number of Northern California rural voters are for the recall and are selling anti-Newsom merchandise. Who do these people rely on for up-to-date news?
Okay. We've talked in the past about how our media marketplace has become much more divided and how many of us on the right and on the left have become much more isolated because we tend to rely on news sources that reinforce our opinions rather than offer a broader range of perspectives. And that's not unique to conservatives. It's something that many progressives fall victim to also. And we've talked in the past and will in the future about the obligation of all citizens to expose themselves to a very wide ideological range of news and opinion and analysis. That said, many rural voters do rely on more conservative news outlets for the same reason that many more progressive urban dwellers tend to rely on more left-leaning outlets. These rural voters generally tend to feel like they are overlooked by a state government dominated by coastal Californians. And over the years, they'll frequently exhibit their frustration in a number of different ways. There's been a recurring movement up in the northern part of California and in eastern Oregon to actually set up a new state, the state of Jefferson, which would recognize the needs of rural residents, of farmers, and others. That doesn't appear to be going anywhere anytime soon, but the recall election is the latest in a series of opportunities to give rural voters who do tend to lean conservative an opportunity to vent their frustrations with a state government that they don't think takes their interests into account.
Is the California Democratic base concerned about Larry Elder, and did Newsom screw up by accidentally elevating Larry Elder too much?
Well, I think just the opposite. The Democratic Party is progressive. Within the Democratic Party, there is a fairly substantial cohort that may have voted for Newsom in 2018 against a Republican opponent, but has never been all that excited about him. Because to many progressive voters, Newsom, while a Democrat, is a fairly centrist establishment Democrat. So when push comes to shove, they support him, but they've never been all that excited about him. And as I mentioned earlier, the poll numbers over most of the spring and early summer showed that if a lot of those progressive Democrats simply didn't bother to vote, that Newsom could be in real trouble. These more left-leaning voters were never going to vote for a Republican candidate, but if they just stayed home or didn't vote out of lack of enthusiasm or lack of motivation, the recall could very well pass. So I think that whether you happen to be a supporter of Newsom's or not, I think he did a very, very smart thing by elevating Elder and by focusing his attacks on Elder, because it did frame the recall, as we talked about earlier, in the context not of a referendum, but of a choice. And for a progressive Democrat who wasn't all that wild about Newsom, They might not have been that motivated to vote early on what seemed to be a straight up or down vote. But once Newsom established the contrast between himself and his most visible opponent, that, in my mind, has almost certainly been the driving force behind Newsom's rise in the polls and support for the recall dropping.
What is Newsom's rationale for asking persons that vote no on the recall to not vote for a replacement? How would that benefit him if he is voted out?
Well, it wouldn't benefit him if he were voted out. Newsom and his advisors believe very strongly that one of the things that cost Gray Davis the governor's office back in the last recall election in 2003 was the presence of Democratic Lieutenant Governor Cruz Bustamante on the ballot. So first, Newsom's team worked very, very hard to prevent other Democrats from running for governor in the recall. And then, because they believe it's a simpler and a more direct message, they felt rather than getting into a more nuanced and subtle discussion about whether some candidates were better than others, they decided it was a much easier message for relatively inattentive voters to simply say, vote no and then go home, rather than weighing the merits of people they didn't want to be governor anyway. My own personal opinion, and I don't take sides all that often on our webinar for all the reasons I've discussed in the past, is that while that was a strategically smart decision by Newsom not to encourage his supporters to vote on the second question, I think it was a somewhat selfish decision on Newsom's part. Now, granted, he's entitled to do everything he can to stay in office. Of course he is, and it looks like he's going to be successful in that regard, in all likelihood. But I feel like perhaps the unintended message Newsom was sending by telling his supporters not to vote on the second question was that if he didn't succeed, the recall did pass, that he, Gavin Newsom, who's devoted the last several decades of his life to public service in California, really didn't care what would happen if he were removed from office. And I think that was an unfortunate message. Again, it looks likely like that's not going to be relevant, assuming the recall is defeated. But even without endorsing a candidate in the second question, I think Newsom would have demonstrated a much greater commitment, not just to his own success, but to the state, if he were to encourage his supporters to make their own smart decision on whether and who to vote for on that second ballot question.
A recent poll showed that 10% of Californians plan to leave the state within the next year. I'm curious how Dan reconciles the responses to the poll questions that seem to support our current governor and the very real exodus from California to other states.
Well, if the recall were to be defeated by an overwhelming landslide, let's assume that 60% of Californians voted against it. Let's assume that 2/3 of Californians voted against it. And we have no idea if that's the case, but let's just assume, for the sake of this question, a very large outcome in one direction. Well, even if the recall is defeated overwhelmingly, that still means that 1/3 to 40% of Californians don't want Newsom to stay governor. And so if one fraction of that pro-recall minority wants to leave the state, statistically at least, it's relatively easy to understand. Now, again, I'm not predicting the outcome. It looks more likely than not at this point that Newsom will defeat the recall. But if it passes with 51% of the vote, then that 10% probably voted in favor of the recall. If the recall is defeated, whether by 51% or 60% or 67%, that's still a large enough number of people who voted for it to explain why 1 out of every 10 Californians has at least entertained the idea of leaving. Remember that Donald Trump got roughly 1/3 of the vote in California, roughly 33%. And that's a much larger number than those who say that they might consider leaving. So longer discussion to be had at some point about those who say that they might want to leave the state and under what circumstances they would follow through. But at least for the statistics on this particular question, 10% is a much smaller number than the pro-recall vote is likely to attract.
Wonderful. Well, we're at the end of the hour. So Dan, thank you so much for another great talk, and to our audience for your great questions. As Dan pointed out, next Tuesday we will be at 5 p.m. Pacific time, 8 p.m. Eastern. So make sure to adjust that date on your calendar. I know a lot of people have really made this a standing date with Dan. So it'll be in the evening instead of in the morning. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Great job as always.
And you too, Dan. That was marvelous how you guided us through those two very intense and complex topics. So thank you again for your time and expertise today.
Well, thank you, Kim. As always, I really enjoyed it, and I hope our group did too, and I'll be excited to see everybody else next Tuesday in the evening.
Absolutely. And in addition to your new time frame next Tuesday, starts next Tuesday, this week on Thursday, we have a terrific program called Power for All, how it works and why it's everyone's business. Also next week on the 13th, the past, present, and future of U.S.-Afghanistan relations and foreign policy. This is the second of two key programs on Afghanistan. On September 15th, the remarkable odyssey of Angela Merkel. And on the 23rd, the future of money with Frank Motek from KABC Radio. So please go to our website at lawacth.org, register today, become a member, make a donation, stay tuned, stay informed, and thank you all for your ongoing support. Take care and see you Thursday. Thanks, Dan.
Everybody.